Show Me the Money is a topic we present at every C-Clear event. We think working to bring money to communities is one of our #1 priorities. And through our EPA grant review, we have brought in over $55 million since we've been the TAB provider. And this year, it's all the more important to hear about the resources that are available because, as you heard from the keynotes, it is historic levels of funding. But the amounts and the type and the mix and the sources have all shifted, and it is challenging to stay current on what's available and how it aligns with your projects. So we are very pleased to bring you this panel today, and I'm going to request that Sophie Young from the Strategic Growth Council kick off the panel, Show Me the Money.
Good morning, or I guess it's not morning anymore, sorry. Good afternoon. I've lost my sense of time during the pandemic. It's great to be here. Thank you. My name is Sophie Young. I'm the program manager of a program called the Transformative Climate Communities at the California Strategic Growth Council. And we are kind of adjacent to the brownfields community redevelopment work in that our agency is a state-level entity that works on interagency policy initiatives. And I'm here because in the last couple years, we've heard from our stakeholders that brownfields funding is a huge barrier to redevelopment, and our mission is to support healthy and thriving redevelopment and climate-resilient development throughout the state. So I'm excited to be here today to introduce this topic on the historic investment and the opportunity available. As you've heard in some of the initial speeches, there is historic funding at both the federal and the state level. And so we have our illustrious fund managers here who will be leading the stewardship of those funds. So we have $1.5 billion in the federal Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill for brownfields funding, also $270 million at the state level through DTSC's ECRG program that you'll hear from, and then also a lot of funding through GoBiz, or the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. So we'll hear from three today in the following order. Mayram Tasnif-Abbasi from the DTSC Brownfields program, and then Noemi Emeric-Ford from the US EPA Brownfields program, and then Mena, who is the Southern California Regional Manager for the Community-Based Solutions program, who will speak to the funding opportunities in technical assistance. And then before we get into that, I will briefly introduce our program to give a little bit of context. So as I mentioned, I'm from the Transformative Climate Communities program that recently has integrated a little bit of brownfields funding into our program investment model. So our program is a community-led model for climate resilient development, and we fund 100% of our investments into disadvantaged communities in California per CalEnviroScreen, which you've heard of, which map the most disadvantaged communities according to pollution and poverty burdens. And we have made $230 million of investments to date in implementation and planning grants. And on the right is an image from the Watts community in Los Angeles, which shows the type of community-driven planning and revitalization processes that we support. And our project framework focuses on funding a host of projects all around climate resilience and social resilience. So we have a menu of project types: affordable housing, low carbon transportation, solar, urban greening. We fund parks. And then we also fund social resilience projects, which I'll get into in a minute. And they're all focused at the neighborhood scale, so all focused on funding a collection of projects. We intend to be like a one-stop shop for projects that will all come online within the 5-year grant term to really accelerate the revitalization of these neighborhoods. And this last year, we incorporated brownfields development as an eligible project type in this menu. And we really consulted with DTSC in developing this project element. And so we fund community or cleanup and redevelopment for specifically community serving land uses. So we are kind of in the development phase of the project pipeline for brownfields redevelopment. And here's an image from Fresno, California, which is one of our first grantees in the community participation process. So if communities do identify, opportunity sites for brownfields redevelopment, we would like to support that through our investments. And then, as mentioned, where the transformative name comes in, we have 3 types of projects that we fund that ensure that these infrastructure projects also result in social and community benefits that are meaningful to communities. So one is community engagement, ensuring that communities are part of the planning and design, and also the implementation of the projects. And then also ensuring that the investment results in workforce training opportunities for project area residents, that they also benefit from these investments. And then lastly, we also have a displacement avoidance plan, which we're piloting through our program, which is that the recipient communities also receive or are also doing co-planning for displacement alongside these infrastructure improvements. So just to give you a sense for our statewide investments so far, as I mentioned, we've had $230 million invested into 26 disadvantaged communities in California. On the left are 8 implementation grants across the state. It's probably hard to see. So Fresno, Stockton, Inland Empire, Ontario, LA, in the LA communities of Pacoima and also Watts, and Oakland. And then we have also had 18 planning grants. And we are currently also expanding to disadvantaged unincorporated communities statewide. And so our funding, currently we've, in the last year, just like a lot of these programs you're about to hear from, we got a influx of funding for the next 3 years. We have $420 million available over the next 3 years. So we are currently in the 4th round of funding, where we have $115 million in appropriations. We have implementation grants, 3 awards at $35 million currently available, and 4 planning grants of $300,000 currently available. And that NOFA, Notice of Funding Availability, will close next week. But perhaps more relevant to some of you is that we also have 2 more future funding rounds in round 5 and round 6, which will be released next year and then the year after. And those are current appropriation amounts. And the anticipated timeline will be releasing the NOFA approximately in February, with applications due in July, and then award recommendations in October. And we also have technical assistance available. So this continues from application through implementation. So please reach out if you are interested in this. And we also have some contact information here. So that, I just wanted to show, I guess, some context on, we have a small bit of brownfields funding, and this is how we're integrating this with the help from our other partners. And now I will turn it over to Mayram.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be sharing a little bit more information on our Equitable Community Revitalization Grant today. As most of you just heard the director's talk earlier, our money comes from the broader Cleanup in Vulnerable Communities initiative. And these are the different programs that we have that's part of this broader initiative. The Equitable Community Revitalization is just one piece. There's going to be a lot of discussion, I think, throughout this conference on the Discovery and Enforcement Program, which is focused on cleaning up dry cleaners. And we have some programs that are focused on technical assistance for communities. We have one that's being developed that's looking at how to integrate community benefit agreements in the work that we do. And we have a workforce component that's also currently under construction. So those are other pieces of this larger pot of money that we received to try and incorporate some more holistic changes throughout these communities that we're working on. And just like Sophie mentioned for her grant, our grants are also focused on the high CES score areas. This is more of a takeaway for you guys to access this online that has a little summary of all the different grants that I just mentioned, all the different programs that I just mentioned that are part of CVCI. So for those of you who are not as familiar with the Equitable Community Revitalization Grants as our grantees are, we have a $270 million allocation. We just completed the first round. The first round was for $70.5 million. We plan to open up the second round of applications probably sometime in December or fall. These grants are available for conducting community-wide assessments, investigations, and cleanups. And they're just three fairly distinct different types of applications. The community-wide assessments are the most basic. They're for those of you who are looking at several sites within your community, maybe starting off the planning process and wanting to understand more about the inventory, the environmental impacts, to take it to the next stage, to see if the investment in further determining what the environmental conditions are is of value to you and your community. So those are really sort of these fundamental applications or application types that we're looking at. We only received 7 of these, and what we're going to be doing is working with our existing applicants to try and refine that a little bit more. And when our next guidelines come out, we want to be able to make it a little bit more broader, and hopefully the applicants that we're trying to reach will see a little bit more benefit in these, and maybe be able to use it for some broader uses. So the way the CALRC screen score works is that priority is given to sites that are within these red areas, which represent 75% and above CALRC screen score, like the most burdened communities based on the methodology that CES uses to intersect the demographies with the pollution data. But what we do also have is a carve-out, because we recognize that there are rural communities and there are other communities that for many reasons may not have a high CALRC screen score, but may still be a community in need. So we are open to those applications as well. In fact, for this round that we just announced, we have a lot of applications that came from lower CALRC screen scores if you look at the total scores, but their poverty screen was really high. And the uses that they proposed were focused on a vulnerable community. And so that was the way we were able to bring in some of these sites from these lower CALRC screen areas, because we recognize that there are going to be geographies that may perhaps have cleaner air, so they don't make that high score, but still have some very important needs that we can support through this funding. So in terms of details, we are looking at these different funding lines. Now, these different funding amounts that I have up on the screen for the different types of grants, this is what we offered, right? We just talked about how we're making announcements today. These may change for the next guidelines to some degree. I'm not 100% sure, but this is where we were for this particular cohort. The funding timeline is for 2 years. We want to make clear that people understand that that's just a funding timeline. There's a timeline for the project, and the timeline for the project can go beyond that funding timeline. Because we have a very short expiration date on our funds, we have to use the funds fully within a full 4-year period. It's taken us 1 year to get the grant out, right? So we've already got 3 years left. So the idea in creating this 2-year timeline was that we'll work with our grantees to get as much work done as possible. There perhaps keeping this extra year gives us some flexibility to maybe increase the term of the grant if it makes sense at the time. So much of what we're doing is happening for the first time. So we are not 100% sure of the way things are going to work. What we're hoping to do is with this first cohort, we will learn, adjust, adapt, and have guidelines change a little bit to hopefully make it tighter, make it stronger, and make it easier for these communities to work and to access the money. We require regulatory oversight for all of our projects. The regulatory oversight agency does not have to be DTSC. It can be the water board. It can be a local agency. We are bringing on a lot more local agencies through a new certification process, so there are more and more agencies that can work on these sites. We will work with all our applicants to help them understand what these different requirements are, and we'll be holding workshops on the new guidelines fairly soon, just to give people a head start, because I think the new applications are coming out in December. We want to make sure that everyone is prepared and ready to hit the ground when the new applications come up. I'm just redoing the slide because I love it. I think it's fantastic, and it's nice to see so many of our grantees here today. These are the stats that the director also shared with us earlier today. One of the things that we are very keenly aware of is that the geographies for our sites are very focused in these urban core areas of Northern California and Southern California. What we're hoping to do is really expand our reach and go beyond, and hopefully the next time we show this map sometime next year with our new cohort, we'll have a lot more dots spread in a lot more areas. Part of this is, I think there are a lot of brownfields in these urban core areas. That's not to say that there aren't in some of these other sites. We know there's a gap in the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, and one of the things we're hoping to do is partner with GoBiz in particular to use resources from other agencies and established relationships to get the word out on the money being available and to provide the assistance to bring the applications in. So the guidelines are going to be, we're going to start workshopping the new guidelines as early as July. And we are going to be having some feedback sessions where we're going to pull in our grantees, applicants, or people who are looking to apply. There's going to be I think some sort of like an open session that we'll do to try and get feedback. We may do some surveys and some polls, because we really are trying to understand for those of the people who applied and were successful, who applied and were not successful, those of you who knew about it but couldn't apply. We want to understand that, because we have a window to be able to gain that feedback and build a better program. This is also more for take home. I just listed all of our resources. Even though the guidelines are going to be updated, the general structure is going to be the same. So if you're not familiar with our program, I would say go ahead and take a look through our guidelines and see if this is something that you can use in your community. I wanted to also kind of give a big plug for the Center for Creative Land Recycling. They're very present and are the main organizers of the conference today. As has been mentioned several times during the conference, they are our brownfields technical assistance provider. It's really important that if you are interested in applying, engage with CCLR as early as possible. They are, fairly soon, as soon as we're done with Carson, going to get on and start taking appointments for these early discussions. All of our grantees who worked with CCLR did really well. They were able to develop better, stronger applications, and we've seen that with CCLR's involvement with EPA and EPA's applications as well. That assistance, which is a little bit outside of our department, is more focused. They're able to do a lot more than what we can do because they have an expertise in understanding land much more so than we do. So I strongly advise you guys to get in touch with them, make an appointment, and that's the reason why we have partnered with them, because we understand their expertise in this area. And I just wanted to close with the reuse, rebuild, and revitalize. So much of what the ECRG does fills, these different boxes. We are trying to make land available. We're trying to reduce environmental uncertainties so that the revitalization can happen, so that the reuses actually happen. We've also tried to incorporate equitable development commitments into our process. This was something that was new to us, but this intersection of the work that we do and bringing equity in the work, something that Dr. Williams mentioned, is really important to us. And so we do think that the ECRG sort of lives and breathes the sort of framework of reusing, rebuilding, and revitalizing. And I think with that is my last slide. I'm going to turn it over to Noemi from EPA.
Which button? Miriam. Yeah. So good afternoon. So just to get a feel for who's in the room, for those of you who have used EPA funding, could you raise your hand for me? Okay, and for those who didn't have their hand raised, how many are interested in EPA funding? Okay. And so for those who didn't raise your hand, wake up, where are you? No, just kidding. So anyway, I will start with, I'm Noemi Emeric-Ford, and I work for US EPA in our brownfields program. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, well, that wasn't the right button, clearly.
Did you break it?
It's okay. That's why you asked for directions. So I'm going to start first with, so you've heard this several times today about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funding. So US EPA received quite a bit of funding under this new act, and specifically for brownfields. EPA as a whole, obviously, EPA is much larger than brownfields, even though I think brownfields is probably the most important. As you can see from the slide here, we received about $5 billion, but $1.5 billion is coming to brownfields. The bulk of the funding, as you can see here, is going to our water infrastructure. So for those who also represent communities, you're interested in water infrastructure, you're interested in our Superfund program, which has some of the nation's most hazardous waste sites. They also received quite a bit of funding. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is the funding under our brownfields program, the $1.5 million that we received. So first, I just want to start with, when you think about brownfields and kind of how EPA can help and how our funding can help, is going through all of this. It's first thinking about where's there a site, discovering where the site is. And the site could be something, just a vacant lot where it's not being redeveloped because people think that there's contamination there. And so that's when you first discover your site. Then moving into the assessment phase, that could mean your environmental assessments, that can mean your planning assessments, and all of that EPA can fund and assist you with. And then you move into, after you've conducted your environmental assessments and you know what kind of contamination exists there, then you move into your planning stage. Okay, we have this type of contamination, how do we need to clean it up? And based on the price tag that might be associated with that remediation, let's start our planning for what do we envision the site to be. Then you move into your cleanup, and then eventually into your revitalization. So all of the steps moving from cleanup and going backwards to site discovery are things that US EPA can fund. We can't fund the actual revitalization work, but we can do some of the planning work for it. And because we are a public agency, of course, community engagement would be throughout the entire process. Want to ensure, kind of what Miriam said and what Dr. Williams said, is we want to make sure that the community is engaged early and often throughout this process. And so how can we help? How does EPA and our funding, how do we support community redevelopment? And so first, it's identifying priority sites in your community. So working with your community residents, or just even things that the city might have or the county might have on its plate, what are our priority sites? Then doing your community outreach and your planning. Again, engaging the community early and often. And then looking at what your conceptual site plans might be. So you heard from the mayor of Carson, the 157 acres they had. Look how many times they had to go through and do community outreach and do their site conceptual plans until they realized, you know what, we need to break up this site and do the redevelopment in parcels. You can do your, obviously we're the EPA, So we're going to fund the environmental work. Your phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments to tell you how contaminated the property is. We'll pay for the remediation. And then a lot of work that we'll do that people don't understand is we want to make sure, we not only want sites cleaned up to be protective of human health and the environment, we want to see sites redeveloped. We want to see the reuse, the rebuild, and revitalization happen. So we'll help you do that. Financial planning models, market studies, infrastructure studies, all those things can be supported with our brownfields funding. And so this is just going to walk, oh, I don't know what happened to that slide. Didn't look like that on my computer, but these are all of our different grant types. And so what I'm going to focus on is the different types of grants that you can apply for and what those grants will fund. So first, thinking about our grants. So here now you can read it a little bit better. Our assessment grants, which is kind of inherent in the name, it's for conducting environmental site assessments. Our cleanup grants that will get sites cleaned up. Our revolving loan fund grant, which the revolving loan fund is a grant given to an entity, and then you in turn could take and do loans and sub-grants out to others in your community that might want to clean up sites. And then our job training grant program, which I'll talk a little bit about. So let me go back to this slide for a second. So I wanted to hone in, I think Miriam might be a little bit further along than we are in terms of the funding they received. We have had our funding for over 20 years. So this is an annual process where we give out this funding. The bipartisan infrastructure funding is something new. This would be our first year in really thinking about how we want to spend this money. So in 2022, where we just made some awards for grants, these were the funding amounts that we had. So now with our new bipartisan infrastructure law, there is high amounts that we could go up to. We probably won't go up to a $10 million or a $5 million cleanup, but what amount we're going to land at, we're not sure yet. We're still in that planning process. And so talking about going out and hearing from communities, EPA's in that process as well, trying to figure out what might be the spot that you need to get sites assessed and or get sites cleaned up. The only one we've made the determination on is our job training grant program. Used to be funded at $200,000 and now it's at $500,000. So for our grants, very similar to DTSC's grants, the eligibility, almost everybody's eligible. States and local governments, tribes, nonprofits. Nonprofits, so I want to hone in on if there's any affordable housing developers in the room, you have to be a 501c3 nonprofit in order to apply for our funding. Any type of regional governmental entities, as long as you're a public agency, you'd be eligible to apply for our funding. So we get a question a lot about joint powers authorities. They're also eligible to apply. So I want to first start with our brownfields job training program, only because the request for applications is open right now. So the deadline is August 2nd. This is the grant that I was speaking about earlier that used to be $200,000 and now it's jumped up with our bipartisan infrastructure funding to $500,000. And this is funding that you would use to train residents in your community to be able to get the environmental jobs that you would do through brownfields, whether it's conducting the environmental assessments, doing the remediation, or focusing on what the end use would be in terms of the redevelopment that might happen at the site. So if you're in the Southern California area and you're interested, you have people within your community who might be interested in this program. We have the Los Angeles Conservation Corps, who is a current grantee and has been a grantee of EPA's for quite some time using this funding. They have a beautiful poster in the back that talks a little bit about their program. Alex and Denise, why don't you wave your hands so I'll see who you are. Be happy, or if you're interested in starting a job training program, that's who you should talk to. We also have at that table 2 other job training grantees. I'm going to call them out. So we have Merle, who's with the city of Pittsburgh, and then we have Fred, who is with the city of Richmond. They also conduct the job training programs and could tell you a little bit more about how valuable this program is. So this is just to give you an idea. One of these is from Richmond, where they ended up training residents and they went to work at renewable energy, got renewable energy employment working at a particular site. We also have another example, Nye County in Nevada. They receive funding from us to also work on a project. It's just illustrating that we want to ensure that whatever redevelopment is happening, that it's sustainable, that it's putting people to work, and that it's equitable. So another grant type that we have is our multi-purpose. So this is a newer grant for EPA. But this grant allows for both assessment and cleanup in one application. So for those of you who raised your hand who have EPA grants, you might have applied for an assessment grant and then you applied for a cleanup grant. And just applying for grants can be tedious and it can be difficult. We decided to combine the two and make this multi-purpose grant where you can get both within one grant. Usually funded at $1 million. It has a longer grant term. It's up to 5 years. And you can also do a lot of those other things that I talked about within this grant program, which is community engagement and redevelopment planning. Our assessment grants, we have several different types of assessment grants. You can apply for funding to just focus on one particular site. I do not recommend that. Always apply for community-wide, because if you apply for one specific site, and you know, we're the federal government, it takes a while to do something, you're not going to get your funding for like 8 months. If you want to switch it to another site, you cannot. So it's best just to apply for a community-wide grant, have that one particular site you're interested in within that larger community-wide assessment grant. You can also apply for coalitions. So let's say there's 2 or 3 communities out here who just don't have the capacity to write a grant. You don't have grant writers, you don't have the time. You could partner with like a National Development Council, or you could partner with your county. They could apply, bring you in as coalition members, and then the funding could be spent at whatever sites that you have within your community. So our Brownfields Revolving Loan Fund program. So this is probably the harder grant to implement because it is funding that comes to you, but then it's funding that you turn around and act like the loan provider and you give out loans. We call them sub-grants, but most people call them forgivable loans, so that cleanups can happen within your community. And so this is really powerful for communities who are really focused on making revitalization happen. This is another tool in your incentive toolbox to get private developers to come to the table by saying, look, we can give you a 0% interest loan for you to get this property cleaned up, and getting them to do some of the redevelopment that you might be interested in within your community. So under our Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funding, once you get this grant, you then can apply every year after that for what we call supplemental funding, and it's non-competitive. So once you get the $1 million, in the future years, you can receive funding without having to go through the competitive process. And so DTSC had this grant for 15 years. They used all of the money loaned out, having some loans repaid. They have some funding remaining that they can also still do this until they get the money spent down. So our cleanup grants, in the past it was $500,000. I'm not sure what it'll be under the infrastructure law, but $500,000 can fund 1 cleanup, or you can apply and do 3 cleanups. So you might have 3 or 4 projects within your community where you only need to spend $100,000, and you could use the money at all of those sites. The trick here with this funding is that you have to be the fee simple title owner of the property. Unlike the ECRG grants, where you don't have to own the property, under US EPA's guidelines, you have to be the owner of the property. So just to give you an idea about it is a competitive grant program. So in 2021, we had about $80 million available. We had 600 applications. This is nationwide. Our most popular grant type is our assessment grants. That's where we receive the most applications. We ended up awarding about 300 for assessments, or 300 total, 200 for assessments, 71 for cleanups and RLFs, and then 20 for job training. And so in 2022, because we used a portion of our bipartisan infrastructure, you can see that we had $147 million that was going to be made available. In the future years, it'll be $100 million added on top of the $80 million, and may even jump up to $150 along with the $80 million, because not only do we have the infrastructure money, we're still getting our regular appropriation funding from Congress. So one other, this is not a, oh yes.
So I have a question.
Are we
regarding
taking questions?
The bipartisan
Okay.
infrastructure funding. That cannot be mixed with the annual appropriation, correct?
Right, so what she's alluding to, for those who have grants that are in the room, who have used EPA funding in the past, the bipartisan funding has to be a new cooperative agreement. It's a new grant that we would open. We wouldn't combine that funding into another grant that you already have, because it's being tracked separately, so you are correct. So outside of our grant programs, everything that I talked about before this are things that you have to apply for. You have to submit a longer application, kind of give us your story on why you need the funding. Our targeted brownfields assessment program, is where we have contractors on retainer and our contractors will go out and do the work for you. But again, in the title, it's only for assessment work. So it's only for environmental phase 1, phase 2s, kind of looking at what the cost estimates might be, looking at what alternatives it might be to clean up the site, but you can only do it for assessments. And I don't know, is Cynthia still in the room? So Cynthia Breen is with Tetra Tech, and they're our consultants that we have on retainer, and they'll go out and do the work for us. And so just so it's a 2-page application. You can do it online. It's a rolling process, so there is no time frame for you to apply for this. The only thing we're looking for is to ensure that you have the leverage funding, that you have the redevelopment that's going to happen soon. So we don't want to create these reports and then they just sit on a shelf. We want to make sure that you're going to be moving into revitalization soon. And so we do have also other contractors on retainer. I don't know if Mary's in the room. Mary Hashem? Nope. So we have other technical assistance providers who are consultants to EPA who will do some of the work that's listed on here. So I talked about earlier, you can do this yourself with the grant funding we give you, but let's say you have a property, but you really just want to know, you know what the revitalization is going to be, but you want to know if it'll pencil out. We could help you do some of that work, bringing consultants in to help you do that. And so this is just to give a couple of examples. I think City of LA, David's in the room. So this is a project we're working on, City of LA. For those who are familiar with LA, there is a river in LA. Might be channelized right now, but they're working on that. We're trying to do some redevelopment with them. We funded some cleanup and some assessments. It's a project in San Diego. I know Jessica, you've worked with in San Diego. It's a transitory development project that we did in San Diego, building some affordable housing right near the trolley stop. We do even larger sites. This is a former pulp mill in the Samoa Peninsula. Humboldt County has received a bunch of funding from EPA, working on trying to redevelop this property. And then just want to talk about, even though I am competitive, DTSC is our partner. Even though we both provide funding, we are not competing. You can layer the resources. We want to work with Strategic Growth Council. We want to work with GoBiz. And so just know that even if you get our funding, you can still get DTSC's funding. You can still get Strategic Growth Council. You can still get GoBiz. So all of our resources can be layered. And at the same time, it doesn't have to work one in front of the other. They can work simultaneously together. So our funding can be used to provide DTSC oversight. So if you had a grant from us, same property you're working on with them for ECRG, that's how you can make the funding work together. Our targeted brownfields assessment program might tell you initially a property is contaminated, and then you apply to DTSC to get their cleanup funding. So just wanted to kind of talk about that. We're all in partnership, and you can use all of this money at the same time. So lastly, here's my contact information. There's another conference that's coming up. It is EPA's premier conference. It's called the National Brownfields Conference. We do it every 18 months. If you're interested, here's some information. You can go to the website. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael. Thank you.
Hi guys, my name is Matthew Mena, and I am with GoBiz on the community-based solutions side of the house. So just a little bit about why I'm here. So GoBiz, our mission is to be the point of contact for job growth, economic development, planning and solutions, and business assistance for local communities, businesses, and any community-based organizations as well. Our services that we provide are pretty diverse. We provide attraction, retention, and expansion services, as well as confidential and no-cost site search for businesses. And that's really kind of the crux of what GoBiz did initially on the economic development side. We realized that permitting and regulations was a barrier of entry for businesses to come into the California market. And so we created the permit assistance side of the house as well. We also have a small business advocacy and assistance team, which has a network of small business development centers throughout California. We have an international trade and development team that works with businesses that wish to import or export. They also have contacts with the commercial services on the federal side. And then lastly, which is something new that GoBiz has started to do, was assist on the economic development planning support side. we realized through the pandemic that there were many communities that had major projects and major infrastructure projects that they needed funding, and they didn't have a solution for it. And so they contacted GoBiz. At the time, we didn't have a team for that. And so that's why we started to create new teams, as you can see in the next slide. So our clients are businesses, and that was our initial, that's why we were initially created. Also local governments, academic institutions, and community-based organizations. And all of them, if they're looking for assistance, we're the point of contact, and we pride ourselves on finding a creative solution for any problem. So GoBiz has grown substantially in the past couple years. Initially, we started with CalBiz, and if anybody worked in economic development about 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, you knew that there was only about 3 or 4 people throughout the state. During the pandemic, on the CalBiz side, we grew to have in-territory representatives to help either businesses or local governments who are hoping to attract more businesses. We also have the Permanent Assistance Team, the Office of Small Business Advocate, the International Affairs and Trade, the California Competes Tax Credit Unit, which is very, very popular 3 times a year when the application periods are open. We have the ZEV, or the Zero Emissions Vehicle Team, that works on regulations as well as solutions for manufacturers, as well as on the community side when they're starting to implement any zero emissions vehicle infrastructure. The California Film Commission is part of GoBiz as well, along with the Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, or iBank, which provides bonds for, tax-exempt bonds for businesses, as well as bonds for communities as well. Visit California, surprisingly, is part of GoBiz. So they work on attracting visitors to our major attractions throughout the state, going from Redding, California, down to the Imperial County. We have the Energy and Climate Team. We also have the Community and Local Equity Grants Team, which provides mental health grants for local community groups who are wishing to implement those types of programs throughout their territory, as well as cannabis districting information as well, for any communities that wish to create a green zone within their jurisdictions. So, like I alluded to previously, throughout the pandemic, we realized that communities needed a solution to major problems that they were having. And so, with that being said, we created the Community-Based Solutions Unit. And that was through funding from the EDA, or the U.S. Economic Development Administration. And they granted us funding for a pilot unit. So this unit will be online for a year so far, hopefully 2, until we start moving it forward, and hopefully it'll become an actual unit within GoBiz. The CBS team is made up of in-region representatives. And this is important because we realized as the state, we have to have people within the territories that really understand the problems of each region. And this team, these representatives will provide support services for those communities, as well as helping with the implementation of the regional economic development strategies. And these are funded by the Community Economic Development Resilience Fund, which is a program that is currently taking in applications right now for economic development strategies, which will bring together local government, community-based organizations, as well as academic institutions to really kind of break down those silos and have projects that can really change those communities that are applying for that program. The team will also be creating an interconnected network of local practitioners with state and federal governments, as well as accessing available resources, such as my partners here at the table. So, as I spoke earlier, we have 13, the team will be made up of 13 in-territory representatives. These representatives will be working to and are working currently to help provide hands-on access to local economic development organizations, community-based organizations, as well as local jurisdictions and other stakeholders to provide resources for major projects that they are interested in getting funded. And a lot of the work on our end is actually educating the local side on what programs are actually available to fund those programs. The team will also have 3 regional managers as well, which I am one of them, luckily. The regional managers will be working on cross-regional collaboration. We understand that major projects will cross over territories as well as counties, and so we wanted at least 3 people to work on that side of the house as well. We also have a place-based specialist who specializes in helping communities, and he has been doing this for some time now, implementing different mechanisms to help fund different projects. And this can be anything from tax increment financing districts, as well as opportunity zones or promise zones. We're currently actively hiring a broadband action plan specialist and a broadband permit specialist to support the communities in accessing the state and federal funds to support broadband for all. So these are the 13 regions that we will be representing and we will have specialists in. As you can see, we span throughout the state, hoping that we can bring as much support as possible throughout California. These are the 3 super regions. And as you can see, most of those regions, especially in Southern California where I'm at, there are a lot of collaborative projects that will span all of those counties. Currently, we are still hiring, so there are some vacancies still on the table here. But this is our leadership for the team. This is our CBS team in the Northern California region. We are currently in the end process of hiring a manager for Northern California, but we're still actively looking for applicants within the territory as well. And you'll see this throughout the slides so far. And then this is Central California. We are still actively hiring 3 applicants right now, so if you have anybody in mind that is interested in applying, you can send them my way and I'll send them the link. And then here in Southern California, I am still looking for 2 representatives for LA and Orange County. Again, if you have anybody in mind, I would be more than happy to speak with them as well. But lastly, as you can see, this GoBiz is taking an active role in ensuring that there's no region left behind, and hoping that every region has the same opportunity to access funds as the others. That way, there's no region that is left behind. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like we have some time for questions, but first I wanted to ask the panel a couple questions just to kind of tie everything together. They started to really introduce a lot of the resources that are available, and I know that there's a separate a panel on layering funding, but I thought it would be helpful if each person could speak to the points in the process that your funding or your services are available to a person looking to develop a site, a project developer or a local entity looking at a site or several sites.
Sure, I think I'll go first since I think that's probably how it's going to work out. So for GoBiz, we would be getting in contact with a local government, or a local government or organization would be getting in contact with us and asking us if we had any solutions for funding brownfield development. In turn, we most likely be contacting both of you, and then that's where our side of the house is.
I can go next. So for us, like Noemi was mentioning, we think because we've had such a successful history in the past of taking whatever little grant money we've had and kind of pairing that up with EPA's money, we'll be able to translate that very effectively with the ECRG. In fact, one of our grantees, San Diego State University, has been in a very lucky position to have both received an ECRG grant and funding from EPA. So we're actually going to be having that conversation to see what that looks like. So it's a really great time, and we're glad that it happened in our first round, so we can understand in more specificity what that looks like. And I think moving forward, we will try and have more partnerships with EPA and the Strategic Growth Council and Housing and Community Development, because we want to see our projects go from cleanup to build up. And that needs money and that needs resources. What I think our partnership with GoBiz is going to look like is that I showed you the map with the concentration of sites in very specific areas. And that's where we think our partnership with GoBiz can be really fruitful, because GoBiz is in that space, in these geographies, that's placed with a place-based focus, where when they are going out to talk to communities about resources, we'd like to be part of that conversation so that a larger buffet is provided to choose these different fundings.
And so I'll answer from EPA. One of the things that I didn't touch on in my slides that I think would be the first entry point would be working with Center for Creative Land Recycling. So they were our partner first. They were our technical assistance provider since 2009. And then Mayram, DTSC, saw how good they were and brought them on board. But I say that because they provide technical assistance on a variety of areas that I touched on and where our grants could come into play. So if you're really not familiar with brownfields at all and you're looking just to start the conversation, I'd say go to Center for Creative Land Recycling first. If you have used EPA funding in the past, I think in my slides I touched on the various points. We can hit on everything except the actual revitalization. So we cannot pay for the buildup, but everything leading up to that, we can assist you with. And that's where we would turn to partners across the state, whether it's Strategic Growth Council or others, or maybe go to GoBiz and say, okay, who can fund this economic development for the city? Help them find some money for the actual buildup. We'll do all of these other points. So I think the thing that I guess I'd leave you with on the question is, don't think you have to talk to us individually. You can talk to us all at the same time. And we talk to each other as well. And so we can help pull in those conversations. We can all meet with you to strategize about how we can help you best. And so I would say if you're really wanting to start new, either go to GoBiz or go to Center for Creative Land Recycling, and then they can tie in us and other partners as well.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. Just to hear from a project development perspective. And I think, as I mentioned, then we have a small bit of funding for that build-up portion that the existing funding for brownfields redevelopment doesn't currently have as much of. My second question is, so there are a lot of new efforts around integrating equity. How do you actually operationalize equity into the programs? And I think this is, we've seen this through our program. It's a new space for folks. And so in your work currently, integrating this into this funding, I guess, do you have any advice for people on how to, understand the best ways to do these types of projects, that meet your program objectives?
So I'll go first. As a public agency, it's not us at EPA that would help you decide that. We have consultants on retainer who do this all the time. So for instance, the city of Los Angeles, the project that was up there, the LA River, the city wants to ensure that by creating this new redevelopment along the LA River, the people who live there now won't be displaced somewhere else. And so they're building a community equitable development plan, right? And so our consultants are helping them gather the data to see what are the entry points, how can they look at this, how can they make a plan that's not just something that's going to sit on the shelf, but that will really make an impact. And so even though we as a government may not be able to answer these questions, because maybe we as a government have created some of these issues, as you saw from Dr. Williams' slide, we know that we can help be the solution though. So we can get those who have the experience and expertise and can work with you to make sure that that doesn't happen.
I can answer the question from a different angle. For us, this really is a new space. We have asked for equitable development commitments in our ECRG grants that have come in the form of job creation, increasing access to transport, creating safer and healthier communities, and alleviating environmental justice issues. But we're on a broader exploration based on what we've seen from our various applicants. And so I think one of the things that we're going to do is explore different methodologies to incorporate equity in the cleanup work that we do. And we will explore community benefit agreements and different types of methodologies to measure equitable outcomes post-cleanup. Where that lands, we're not sure, but we think we're at least asking the questions, and asking the questions is the first step.
I think that's a really interesting question on our side of the house. So we work on the advocacy side for communities. So a lot of it would be communicating with the local client or the person who's asking for funding, and communicating that equity, the measurement of equity is an important factor when being awarding these funding from either the EPA or other agencies as well.
Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
So Huntington Park is very interested in installing EV charging stations within its public parking lots, the parks that we've applied for. Do these EV, or your program, does it have to be in a brownfield situation, or can they be in other sites throughout the community? And again, I think it's to help the equity of the social equity of our community by having available EV charging stations, especially for our community that is higher. The population is a higher rent population versus home ownership, and so a lot of renters don't have access to these stations. Thus, they may not go and purchase or rent or lease a electric vehicle because we don't have any charging stations in our community. So we're looking hard at implementing, working with Public Works, and trying to see where we can install EV charging stations. So I think the question might be to the GoBiz person here. Okay. Thank you.
For electric vehicle charging stations in particular, depending on where you're at and who services your region, I know SoCal Edison does have a Charge Ready program that is aimed towards the equity portion, whether that's providing charging stations at affordable housing units or parks or even schools, and they'll work with you on that process.
Questions? If not, thank you all for attending. So we will also be available for additional questions if you have some one-on-one, and I'll let Jean announce that. So I just wanted to thank everybody for attending and all the panelists for sharing this great opportunity and funding. I think there's a great opportunity to achieve a lot of our multiple objectives. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Jean.